Thank you so much, folks, for joining me today here on Legal View. I'm going to be bringing you a very special conversation I had with a gentleman by the name of Seth Stern. He's a legal journalist, but also he is the chief of advocacy for the Freedom of the Press Foundation. And we have a conversation about the Don Lemon case and the implications of that case. Just want to give you some background, just in case you're not aware. Don Lemon is the former CNN anchor. He now works for Lemon Media. And he is being charged with a federal crime, federal conspiracy charges, and federal violations of the FACE Act in Minnesota. Don Lemon was involved in covering a protest back in January of this year, January 18, 2026, at a church. I think it was called the Twin Cities Church, but it's in St. Paul, Minnesota. There was an ICE agent who was a high-ranking member of the church. So this group went to protest there. It was covered by Don Lemon. And the government brought charges against him and said that he had conspired with the protesters to violate the FACE Act. The FACE Act allows people to worship in peace. If you disrupt someone's worship or ability to worship, you can be charged under this act. There's some question as to the constitutionality of this act, but I won't get into that here. But I can tell you that FACE Act was originally meant to protect, or it was conceived to protect folks who were going to get abortion back when abortion was legal. In order to get that law passed, Congress, to get bipartisan support, had to add this church element to it. So if you're going to protect people who are going to get an abortion, you also have to protect the people going to church to worship. That was sort of the deal that was struck. And again, the constitutionality of that is still in question. But anyway, it has come out that when they tried to charge Don Lemon with that crime, they went to a couple of judges with the information they had, and they would not give them a warrant for his arrest. They appealed the decision. The appeals court would not give them a warrant for the arrest. So they ultimately went to grand juries, not just one, not just two, but three different grand juries in order to get an indictment. We're at the stage now where Don Lemon's attorneys are claiming they want this dismissed. They're claiming it's a vindictive prosecution, that this administration specifically went after Don Lemon and another journalist by the name of Georgia Fort in order to, A, send a message to other journalists who have been critical of the Trump administration. Don Lemon had been in Minnesota covering the ICE immigration practices there, was very critical of it. And this administration had put out a number of various memes, social media posts, comments, statements, very, very detrimental and very negative towards Don Lemon in the lead up to bringing these charges against him. This is a case of first impression. No case has ever been brought like this under the FACE Act. And so that should tell you something as well. So Don Lemon's attorney, Abby Lowell, is seeking to dismiss the charges. Number one, saying they don't even state charges. Number two, that this is a vindictive prosecution. So I got to thinking, did Don Lemon commit a crime? They make allegations. And even if he did those things, is it a crime? Where's the line for journalists, especially in this age of independent journalists? Where's the line? Do you have to have some sort of credential to be a journalist? What does the First Amendment really protect? And then finally, if in fact it is found this is a vindictive prosecution, maybe there was some mischaracterizations, misinformation given to the grand jury, if it was deliberate, not deliberate, is there recourse for journalists under these circumstances? Look, it's no small thing. Those of you who watched me know that I say anytime you're in the system, man, it is awful. It's not a great place to be. There's anxiety. There's emotional distress, not to mention the cost. And I can tell you the cost on the federal level is much higher than the cost on the state level. Those are much more specialized attorneys. So the cost is there as well. So even if the charges get dismissed, the damage has been done to someone like Don Lemon or Georgia Fort under these circumstances, and messages are being sent to journalists all the time. So what recourse is there? And I do want to mention, normally these types of things, if a journalist is found to have disrupted this, that, or the other thing, normally municipal or state charges apply. Well, the state of Minnesota looked at what he did. and also decided not to bring any charges against either journalist. So there's a lot of evidence here that this prosecution will probably end up being dismissed, and this was a frivolous case brought against Don Lemon to send a message to journalists. So I wanted to talk to Seth. Seth is at the front lines of this stuff, and we had a wonderful conversation. So that's some background. And here's my interview with Seth Stern from the Freedom of the Press Foundation. Enjoy. This is Legal View, where we look at the news from a legal point of view. Hello and welcome, folks, to Legal View. I'm Michael Ayala. Thank you so much for joining me today. I truly appreciate it, and I'm very excited. I have a very special guest with me today. His name is Seth Stern. He's a legal journalist, but he's also Chief of Advocacy at the Freedom of the Press Foundation. He's also a lawyer as well, and he practiced media and First Amendment law. Seth, thank you so much for joining me today. Truly appreciate it.
Great to be here.
All right. First and foremost, tell me a little bit about the Freedom of the Press Foundation, what type of work the organization does and the type of work you do for it.
Sure. So the Freedom of the Press Foundation, as the name might imply, is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization dedicated to promoting press freedom and public interest journalism. It was founded in 2012. I joined a few years ago in 2022. I lead the advocacy work, advocating for journalist rights, advocating for laws and policies that further protect press freedom and against those that don't, both to lawmakers and policymakers and to the public, because it's important that people understand the need for press freedom, understand that even journalists they don't like need to be protected so that the journalists they do like can be protected. Beyond that, we also operate the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which is a database of press freedom violations going back to 2017 and updated regularly. It monitors assaults of journalists, arrests of journalists, subpoenas of journalists, gag orders against journalists, and much more. We developed Secure Drop, which is a software tool intended to help journalists communicate and receive documents from sources as securely and confidentially as current technology allows. And we also train journalists on digital security around the country and sometimes around the world. One of our founders was Daniel Ellsberg, who known for leaking the Pentagon Papers. So government secrecy is also a major focus of ours. We file a whole lot of Freedom of Information Act requests, and we litigate a bunch of them as well through outside counsel.
Well, first and foremost, let me say thank you for all the work you guys are doing. It's so important, especially in this day and age. And that sort of brings me to why we're here together. And that's to talk about the most recent high-profile attack on journalism. At least that's how I'm phrasing it. We're going to talk about the Don Lemon case. It's one that has sort of captured my attention. I know Don, we worked together in Chicago, and I've been really upset by the attack on Don Lemon. And I've read through all the, filings or whatever, and the way this case came about. So let me start off by asking you, I know you've covered this case extensively. I know you guys have had eyes on this case because of its importance in terms of the things that you guys do. First and foremost, let me ask you, because this is the question that people are asking me, did Don Lemon commit a crime? That's the sort of basic question. There are allegations flying around. There's a lot of tape as to what he did, which I think is very instructive here. But at the end of the day, did Don Lemon commit a crime in your estimation?
No, I don't think he did. And he certainly didn't commit the crimes he was charged with. If you look at the U.S. Press Freedom Tracker, which I just mentioned, you'll see there have been plenty of instances where journalists have been charged with misdemeanor trespassing for entering into areas where the government contends they weren't permitted to enter. We generally oppose those charges for a number of reasons. Journalists need to be able to cover the news. They don't control where the news takes place. Of course, they can't barge into somebody's bedroom, but when you're talking about public spaces, they need some leeway to be able to do their jobs and serve their constitutionally protected role. But that's a different conversation, because in this case, Don Lemon was not hit with a misdemeanor trespassing charge that could have been resolved by paying a ticket. He was
And just
hit
quickly,
with
those are
federal,
state level charges. And the state of
yeah, or
Minnesota
local.
looked at this case and said that they weren't going to bring any kind of charges against any of the people involved.
Right, right, exactly. Because if we were looking at it from a trespassing perspective, he didn't enter into a private home. He entered into a church that allows anybody in. And, when he was asked to leave, he did. But beyond that, though, this isn't a trespassing case, which, yes, would have been a state or even municipal, prosecution. This is a federal felony case where the federal government attempted to indict Lemon as well as another journalist, Georgia Fort, from Minnesota, I believe 3 times before finally finding a grand jury that would. Came across the country to arrest them. Really remarkable stuff for what at most amounted to an arguable trespassing violation, typically something that local cops would decide whether to deal with. He's charged under the FACE Act, which is a statute intended to protect worshipers as well as workers at reproductive health clinics from people coming in to interfere with their rights to worship or do what they're doing
Well, let's be fair,
at the
Seth.
clinic.
Let's talk a little bit about quickly the FACE Act, right? When you say it was intended to protect workers at abortion clinics, people visiting abortion clinics. In order to get that passed, they had to placate Republicans in Congress. And by doing so, the way they did that was they added this idea, well, okay, if you're going to protect people going into abortion clinics, we're going to add a section that protects people going into churches, right? And,
Right.
and,
Yeah.
and their,
I
their
think.
ability to worship.
Yeah, there's the textual intent that's on the paper, and there's sort of the how the sausage was made story, and I think that's an accurate characterization of how that particular sausage was made. But in any event, there is no credible allegation that Don Lemon woke up that morning and said, "I'm going to interrupt any religious service or interrupt anybody's right to worship." He again followed the news. It was not his decision for this protest to occur in the church. Protesters chose to enter the church because one of the pastors at the church was in a leadership role with ICE at the time where ICE was essentially invading the city of Minneapolis, killing people there, arresting people's neighbors. So there was good reason why protesters made that decision to enter that church, but it wasn't Don Lemon or Georgia Fort's decision. It was protesters' decision. He just did what journalists do. He followed the news. He's also charged with a conspiracy. Again, he isn't the architect of this plan, of this protest. He went there to cover the news. The government is attempting to spin routine journalistic practices like not burning sources, essentially not revealing in advance the protesters' plans as an indication that Don Lemon and Georgia Fort participated in or acted in furtherance of the conspiracy. But that's what journalists do. They don't make the story, they cover the story. They are not going to gain access if you're covering protests and need access to protests. If you rat out the protesters and undermine the protest, you're probably not going to be invited back to cover further protests. And I think
So
we can all
let me ask you
agree.
this. Let me ask you this, Seth. So that's kind of where the story diverges from what's being alleged by the government. The government suggests that he was involved in meetings beforehand. And here's where I sort of have my struggle. If he was involved in meetings prior to, where is there a line for journalists? So they're saying they met at some undisclosed place with some people and they talked about the protest. He was aware of the protest. I didn't see, and maybe I didn't see anything in that suggested he was the one that put the idea in their head or said something like, okay, you guys do this. That'll help me because I can cover it and I can get better coverage. I'll get better ratings or whatever. So talk to me about that aspect of it. If in fact there were these meetings, would that have been crossing the line? Like, where is that line where there might have been a problem in terms of his involvement with the protesters.
Right. No, I don't think that joining meetings that are part of the planning process in a journalistic capacity with the intention of being able to better cover the news story to cultivate sources is in any way evidence of participation in a conspiracy. Had it been sort of a tail wagging the dog situation where he manufactured this protest to give himself a story, and had the protest itself been unlawful, maybe that's a different conversation. Had he provided supplies for the protest? We've seen cases where journalists were alleged to have carried the spray paint that people later used to vandalize something or other at a protest. Maybe that becomes a different story. Had he operated as an activist rather than a journalist, and by that I don't mean his editorial slant, that's fully constitutionally protected, but had he been, again, an organizer of the protest, that might be a different story. Of course, it might also be constitutionally protected. It really depends on the precise facts. The First Amendment is intended to be construed broadly to give maximum breathing room to press freedom, and to discourage any sort of prosecution. And contrary to sometimes popular belief, the First Amendment does not hinge on a reporter's objectivity or neutrality. Reporters are allowed to have opinions.
Okay.
So absent an act in furtherance of the conspiracy, that's really the basic legal element that's missing here. This protest was going to happen with or without Don Lemon.
Right. And his support of it is not criminal in any way, as you just said. But let me ask you, they also allege, and they backtracked on this and said that this was not true. And I think it was contained in the original report that they got that said somehow these journalists were chanting along with the protesters. So talk to me about that. And we'll assume it's true. It is not true. And they've already said it's not true. But had that been a part of this, would that have been something that crossed the line? Or is that just, you're allowed to have a point of view?
It would have been a more difficult case if they were actually participating in the protest, only because under that circumstance, you might be able to make an argument that they did intend to disrupt the worship that was taking place at that church. I would still make constitutional arguments in their defense. I would say that an application of the act to prohibit constitutionally protected protests on matters of public concern, particularly in circumstances that can be dealt with through ordinary trespass laws, would be constitutionally problematic. But yeah, it's fair to say that actually participating in the protest would add a dimension to the case that doesn't exist under the currently known facts, and that's probably why the government attempted to sneak it in there without any reason to believe it was actually true, as this government so often does in criminal complaints. Under the FACE Act, yeah, that would add an element of perhaps there was an intent there to disrupt versus an intent to cover news.
It's interesting because when I watched the video of it, and I watched many, many different videos of it, one of the things they also claim in terms of disrupting the services was his attempt to interview people. And they claim that where the two things, one, he was interviewing, churchgoers as they were leaving or in the church, but also he was standing by the door, blocking people from moving freely in and out of the place. Now, again, the absurdity of it doesn't escape me. But that argument could be sort of put together with what you're talking about in terms of if you're joining in the protest. So disrupting, if that could be considered disrupting under some interpretation, would that be a fair way to look at what was going on?
If you're just looking at the elements of the FACE Act and the way it's phrased, disrupting requires more than standing in the course of doing your job so that someone might have to take one step to the right to get around you. If Don Lemon and Georgia Fort were linking arms and barricading the doors so that nobody could leave, maybe that's a different case. If they were physically pushing people or holding people, stopping them from leaving, maybe that's a different case. But, everybody's physical presence makes it somewhat more difficult for anyone else in the room to maneuver. We take up space. We exist. What can I say? So I don't think criminalizing somebody's mere existence, mere taking up of space in whatever area they happen to be standing at in any given moment is a legitimate use of prosecutorial powers. I've seen no indication that Don Lemon or Georgia Fort intentionally obstructed anybody else from moving around or from leaving. Interviewing people, yeah, that's what journalists do. People might find it annoying to have a microphone in their face or have a reporter ask them questions, but they're free to walk away. And that was the case at this church, as it generally is when reporters conduct interviews.
So I want to talk about Don is part of this new wave. I mean, of independent journalists who are out there doing a really, really good work. And it requires, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, it does require this sort of new age of journalism. In order to get followers, you have to have a point of view now. I was thinking as I watched him covering this thing, it was clear what side he was on. And he made it clear throughout all his reports, which is why he drew the ire of the government, the fact that he was really pretty much against the sort of occupation of Minnesota by ICE agents. Um, but is there these lines? So as you move more and more into this type of journalism where taking a point of view is important, um, are there these lines that these journalists both, and again, I don't think you're an ethics specialist, but clearly as a journalist, you understand them, as all of us journalists do. Do we have to be careful as we move into this sort of independent journalism age, how much advocacy we do? If he had covered it to CNN, it would have been a very different thing. So what should journalists be thinking about as they move into this new wave of journalism?
Yeah, I think it's less a matter of journalists needing to be careful and more a matter of needing to re-educate the public about what the First Amendment really means. If you look back to the journalism that existed at the time the First Amendment was drafted, it was far from objective. We're talking about, political pamphlets by revolutionaries advocating, the overthrow of the then the crown, essentially. We're looking at pretty radical stuff, and some of the framers themselves contributed to those news outlets. So obviously, I'm not here to defend the framers or make them a model of anything, let alone journalism. But when you talk about the intent of the First Amendment, clearly it was intended to publish journalism that is probably more, or protect journalism that is probably more similar to what someone like Don Lemon is doing than to what the Associated Press is doing, which is not knocking it in any way, but it's something that the journalists of that era could have never really conceived of. Objectivity and neutrality, before it became sort of this ethical norm, it was a business strategy. You had wire services like the AP that needed to find a way to appeal to people from New York to Alabama. And the highly partisan, opinionated journalism that was prevalent at the time wasn't going to do that. You could sell that in your hometown, but you couldn't scale it nationwide. So this new journalistic norm took shape where neutrality became the goal. And there have been plenty of critiques of that style of journalism. It has its defenders. I don't think I really need to get into that, but the point is that it's just that. It's a contemporary norm. It is by no means a prerequisite for constitutional protection.
Is everyone with a microphone and a phone these days considers themselves a journalist? Is everyone protected by what we're talking about? There are some people who do it part-time, sometimes some people are more dedicated to it. Is anyone who goes out and wants to report on something protected by the things we're talking?
Yeah, I think we see journalism more as an action than a job title. You can do it every day, or you can do it once in your life. But I've got the freedom, as most appellate courts have recognized, to go out and film police or film a protest or write about things on my social media feed, whether or not I have a business card that says journalist. There might be some circumstances where professional journalists or card carrying journalists need to be given some additional protection just for practical reasons, like press passes. There are only so many seats in a room that can be occupied by press, and it can't just be a total madhouse. So there's some credentialing process. I understand the practical need for those sorts of things, but I advocate for that process to be as permissive as possible, and for credentialing to depend on something other than, does this person report regularly for a mainstream outlet with a history of, attending the WHCA dinner and winning Pulitzer Prizes.
Folks, I'm here with Seth Stern. He is the chief of advocacy for the Freedom of the Press Foundation. All right, Seth, I want to turn back to that Department of Justice prosecution of Don Lemon and talk about the claims by his attorney, Abbe Lowell, regarding vindictive prosecution. This idea that this government didn't like the type of reporting he was doing. I've always felt like maybe race had something to do with this as well. You get that. And they've had a history of openly being contemptuous towards Don Lemon. And Don had a history of being contemptuous towards some of the policies of this government. When we start talking about the way they got to this indictment, the fact that two separate judges said that there wasn't any probable cause with the set of facts that were presented to them, but then somehow they went to a grand jury and was able to get it. Just the fact that they continued on after the first judge is not something you see very often with Department of Justice or, prosecutions in general. What do you make of the fact that they're claiming this is a vindictive prosecution and what that really means? Because we both know that this prosecution is really meant to send a shot across the bow. And so many times now with this particular administration, they'll approach these prosecutions, they'll make all these pronouncements on television, and then once it's quietly dismissed, no one goes back and retracts. So all people remember is that Don Lemon was out there doing something that the Department of Justice said was wrong.
Right. Yeah, I certainly agree with Abbe Lowell that this prosecution is very clearly vindictive for the reasons you said. The degree to which the department pursued this really small-time offense, this very novel interpretation of laws that have never been applied this way. Normally, if you throw out some sort of newfangled interpretation of law that's been around for a while, and you get a no from judges and grand juries, you take the hint and go home. This administration clearly wanted to secure an indictment here, and I don't think it was because they have a strong opposition to disruption of religious services, which ICE itself has a tendency to barge in on and disrupt. So that's the pretext is pretty clear here. And I mean, you can go outside of this case. You can look at every newsroom that the DOJ has pursued with subpoenas and raids, or every newsroom that the Federal Communications Commission under Brendan Carr has threatened or taken action against. They are all newsrooms that are critical of Donald Trump, or at least as that Donald Trump perceives to be critical of him. They are all outlets and journalists that he has labeled as fake news, that he has made clear he doesn't like. And Don Lemon and Georgia Fort are no different. Did race have something to do with it? Very possibly. I don't remember the details, but I seem to recall there being a pretty clearly racist meme posted on some government account soon after the indictments that sort of showed that hand to an extent.
And let me be
That being
clear,
said,
I don't mean that this was a racist prosecution. What I mean is I think the fact that it was a black journalist doing what he was doing bothered them. You know what I mean? It's a nuanced difference, but I just want to make that clear.
yeah, no, I hear what you're saying, and I tend to think that had it been a white journalist who Trump also disliked and had a history with, he would have done the same thing.
Right.
But
Fair.
who knows? Maybe he only would have tried twice instead of three times.
Right.
It's really hard.
Fair.
It's really hard to say. But I do remember there being that meme posted, which I saw as a tell. But putting that aside, Trump's DOJ, Trump's FCC, every other agency that Trump has weaponized against the press pretty much exclusively targets journalists that Trump dislikes, while Trump rewards, the My Pillow Guys network and the Benny Johnson show with interviews and access and appearances. Clearly not a stickler for journalistic ethics when he believes that unethical journalism suits him and advances his interests.
Yeah, no question. So we have that. And what really got me interested in this case and wanting to talk to you is this idea that, yes, I agree. I think we both look at this and think that there was some other motive here other than protecting people who are worshiping. And some of the things that have come out, Abby Lowell was able to argue that, as I mentioned earlier, that there was some facts being spread by the Department of Justice that were untrue. And they did the mea culpa. They said, yes, we made a mistake there. That was in the report we got, blah, blah, blah. And as you said, they didn't bother to check whether any of that stuff was true before they started spewing it out. And there was some question as to if two judges said no, how did you get an indictment from a grand jury? Did you misrepresent something in the grand jury? So the judge has actually asked for the grand jury minutes. So let's say he finds in those grand jury minutes there were some misrepresentations. I said, that would be just terrible. That would be awful. We give people a badge. We expect something better from them. But what is the recourse for journalists? This is no small thing. I've always said I've been in the criminal defense world, and I always tell people, my clients, I would say, getting into the system is the worst place to be. It is just like putting yourself in a dryer and tumbling around. It is horrible. You don't understand half of what's going on, the anxiety, all that stuff. So don't discount the fact. I know Donovan has means, but he had to hire an attorney, the anxiety, the time, the issues that come with this. There are damages here, but I don't see a clear road for journalists to fight back and stop this from happening.
Yes, there are limited legal options because of qualified immunity and other reasons, protections against government officials being held liable for their unconstitutional actions. Beyond that, I think a lot of journalists are somewhat reluctant to file that sort of litigation because, again, if they're looking for work in the mainstream of the media, it's going to lead to a perception that they're more of an advocate than a journalist. So there are both legal and practical limitations at hand. I wouldn't be surprised if there were grand jury misconduct. We've seen that from this administration. For example, in the Broadview 6 case here in the Chicago area where I happen to live, the government had to withdraw that case because of just that. Certainly wouldn't be surprising, and it's although there's the old saying about a grand jury will indict a ham sandwich. In this case, two grand juries declined to indict this particular ham sandwich, and a third did. What happened? Who knows? Maybe we'll find out. Hopefully, we'll find out in due time. We've certainly seen a lot of prosecutorial misconduct from this administration. And on that topic, I think it's worth noting that a lot of the prosecutors engaged in this misconduct are career prosecutors. I think there's this perception among the public that Trump is hiring these recent law school graduates from right-wing schools and putting them on these cases. And that's the reason we're seeing so much misconduct, is that it's all these new people, these new MAGA people. A lot of the time, these are career prosecutors who have been there for a while. So it really does make one wonder what kind of abuses they might have gotten away with in previous administrations. Clearly, we're seeing these are people who are willing to cut any corners that current culture allows. But that being said, the recourse is limited, and like you say, people like Lemon, they're independent journalists. They don't have the backing of major outlets with in-house lawyers, with insurance, with resources behind them. Don Lemon, although an independent journalist, is obviously someone who's well known and has means. There are a lot of independent journalists who don't have that. Georgia Fort being a good example. So it is, as the journalism industry struggles, as more and more reporters are laid off from major outlets or choose to go independent for their own reasons, we're going to see legal attacks, whether they be things like this or just slap suits, gaining more traction because the defenses are down.
So let's just talk quickly a little bit more inside baseball in what you would need in order to break through that veil of immunity that prosecutors have. One would think, and I've had friends ask me this, say, well, if they lied to a grand jury, and again, we don't know if that's happened here, but if it happened, would that not be enough for a journalist to then find some way to sue the individual prosecutor, the government? Again, I understand that there are limitations to that, but in order to stop the government from doing this, and again, we're seeing this administration and possibly in other administrations doing this type of thing over and over, what would you need a prosecutor to do for you to have standing to sue them, either personally or just overall as a government entity?
The bar, unfortunately, is really high, and usually these cases come up. Prosecutors are a whole different story, but usually comes up with law enforcement officers. There was a case out of Texas involving a Facebook journalist named Priscilla Villarreal. She live streamed and reported on police in Laredo, Texas, I believe, and she was arrested and charged under an archaic Texas statute that had never been used before for asking a police officer questions. The law supposedly criminalized seeking non-public information from a police officer or from a government official for personal benefit. And they said that her personal benefit was that, well, she got Facebook likes, and potentially was able to raise her profile as a social media journalist. Now, the case got dismissed, as obviously it should have, but Villarreal attempted to sue. And ultimately, even there, the officers were held to be entitled to qualified immunity. The bar is supposed to be, did they have, a reasonable belief that they were acting in accordance with the Constitution? I would say that any police officer who believes that the Constitution allows them to arrest a journalist for merely asking questions, if that is reasonable to them, they should not be on the police force. But the courts saw it differently. Ultimately, the Supreme Court declined to intervene. So Villarreal is without recourse. So the bar is extremely high. That needs to change. What also needs to change, though, is the judiciary needs to start sanctioning prosecutors.
Right.
The judiciary has ample power to hold lawyers before it, including the Department of Justice prosecutors, in contempt of court. They can be fined, they can be jailed, they can be punished in various ways. And I don't love seeing people thrown into jail, but it's not about the individual. It's about disincentivizing these abuses in a way that is going to stick. And I keep seeing stories where these judges are being commended as, heroes for our democracy because they made some stern remarks to a prosecutor who was violating every ethical norm imaginable, and sort of they wagged their finger at them and wrote a skewering opinion of some sort. But there's no teeth. There are no sanctions. Judges are still kind of stuck in this mindset that probably was never justified at all, but certainly not now. That federal prosecutors are entitled to what's called the presumption of regularity, this sort of benefit of the doubt that they must be acting in good faith. Clearly, they're not, and I understand to some extent why in the past sanctioning a prosecutor might have been seen as a drastic action for a judge to take. But these days it's appropriate and they need to start doing it. Same goes for state attorney disciplinary commissions. We have filed a number of ethics complaints against prosecutors and other government lawyers with state bars over conduct that appears clearly in violation of the ethical rules governing attorneys. And for the most part, state bars find ways to weasel out of doing anything. You'll see plenty of disciplinary proceedings against sort of low-level first-year lawyers who didn't disclose a parking ticket when they applied for their law license. But then someone like Pam Bondi or Brendan Carr or Gordon Cromberg or other high-level prosecutors who are doing things that are actually really damaging to our democracy manage to get away with it. So it raises the question of whether these state bars really are functioning as regulators or whether they're functioning more as protection rackets for their most powerful members.
Yeah, and I think you put it well, because that really is the recourse. Number one, for someone like Don Lemon, you get your case dismissed, right? So you get your case dismissed, and you might get it dismissed with prejudice. You can have some sort of scathing, response by the judge, or, as you say, if they start really using the hammer and coming down on these prosecutors with a little more, throwing them in jail, sanctioning them, things of that nature. And also then there's the ethical aspect of it. When you think about the recourse for journalists, that's really what it is. As far as going any further, there are just too many hurdles to get there, right? I mean, is that fair?
I would encourage journalists to try, but yes, it's an uphill battle for a journalist or anyone else to sue the government. But we're seeing more and more journalists fight back. We're seeing, for example, Katie Fang went into court to sue for access to the Epstein files. An independent journalist, anyone else could have done that, but she took it upon herself to hold the government accountable for violating the statute that was passed to mandate the release of the Epstein files.
Did she just win? Did I read she just won some aspect of that case? I thought I did.
Maybe. There's just this week we saw ABC file its lawsuit against the FCC, fighting back against Brendan Carr's pretextual censorship attacks on ABC, calling it in to renew its license, admittedly in part because it declined to air President Trump's recent speech about the 2020 elections. We've seen the New York Times go to court over the Pentagon policy. The Pete Hegseth's policy essentially requiring reporters to pledge not to publish unauthorized information in exchange for access to the Pentagon. Last week, The Intercept, along with Freedom of the Press Foundation, where I work, sued over Truth Social's practice of selling early access to Trump's truth posts, which are government records, official statements. He announces wars by Truth Social to the highest bidder so that algorithmic traders can profit off of them. So we are seeing journalists bring the government to court, fight back, pursue novel legal theories. There are legal services organizations that are in some instances willing to prosecute these cases for free or at a deep discount. So we're starting to see that happen. We need to see more of it. Of course, people need to be realistic about their prospects under the law, file cases that they have a chance of winning. Don't waste your time and money on lawsuits that are clear losers just because you don't think they should be. On the other hand, we're in a situation where people really need to fight back, and we've seen, despite all the issues with the Supreme Court, we've seen the lower courts issue some pretty good rulings restraining the Trump administration's abuses.
Yeah, the First Amendment, right? I mean, I feel very confident that the journalism as a whole is going to do what needs to be done here. And funny, I'll let you go on this, Seth. What do you see happening with the Don Lemon case at this point, from what you know and what has been public at this point?
Yeah, I would hope that it will be dismissed. If not, then we've really got a big problem. If a court allows this totally frivolous and unprecedented legal theory to go forward, that would be surprising and alarming. But again, I think the question is more what else happens. I'm hoping I can take the dismissal almost for granted as an inevitability. But what else happens, as you've been alluding to? Will there be investigations of the grand jury misconduct that might have occurred? Will prosecutors be sanctioned or punished in any way for bringing the case? Will journalists continue to investigate what led to these charges being filed? Should Congress change hands in the future, or even if it doesn't, will laws be passed, laws be amended to close some of the gaps that the Trump administration has abused? Some of which were visible gaps, like the absence of a federal reporter's privilege to protect journalist source confidentiality. There was a bill that would have created that privilege at the federal level that had bipartisan support in 2024. That frankly Congress didn't prioritize, and then Trump got elected and managed to kill it. There are also gaps that nobody really thought of. I mean, nobody imagined Brendan Carr doing what he does. Nobody imagined the FACE Act being applied in the way it has. So that I think is part of the story too. Not just is this case dismissed, but will lawmakers and policymakers in the future learn the lessons of what we're seeing now and take some of those assumptions, those norms that have been breached, and write them into law?
From your mouth to God's ears, no question, or Congress's ears anyway. Seth Stern, I want to thank you so much for joining me today. I truly, truly appreciate it. I know you're a busy man. Again, Seth Stern, he's the chief of advocacy for the Freedom of the Press Foundation, doing wonderful work on behalf of journalists. Seth Stern, again, thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me. You too.
All right, folks, thank you so much for joining me here on Legal View.